Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Writers Workshop. My name is Salim, and I will be serving as your host tonight. Our topic tonight is the fundamentals of fantasy with local author Ted Sanders. Before I introduce Ted, I do want to give a few library updates and Zoom reminders. If you have questions for staff, there are a few ways you can reach out to us. You can schedule a consultation, and to do that, just go to champaign.org/book-a-librarian, and staff can meet with you one-on-one. You can also chat with us anytime the library is open, and you can email us at librarian@champaign.org. I also want to share a few instructions for communicating through Zoom tonight. So depending on your device, at the bottom of the screen, you should see the option to chat. This will allow you to type your question in. Next to that is a raise hand option, and you can press that if you want me to unmute you and you want to ask your question out loud. Ted will take questions throughout tonight's webinar, so feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. And with that said, I'd like to now introduce our instructor. So Ted Sanders is a local author. He also serves as the Director of Creative Writing at the University of Illinois, and he's here tonight to guide us into the world of fantasy writing. Ted, thank you for being here. I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Salim. Thank you. That's kind of you. Hello, everybody. I can't see you, but thanks for being here. Oh, and a special apology and thank you if you were signed on last time we tried to do this event, and I had a family matter to attend to that came up. Yeah, I think it didn't end up being an emergency really, but for just the wrong amount of time, it was an emergency. Anyway, if you were there, apologies, and if you came back again tonight, thank you for being here. So yeah, I'm Ted Sanders. If you don't know who I am, as Salim mentioned, I'm a writer. I'm a writer of both literary fiction and, well, I really started out writing literary fiction, short fiction, via classes I was taking at Parkland and U of I as an older undergraduate. It took me a while to finish my undergraduate studies. But I started out writing short literary fiction in my early 30s, and my first book was actually a collection of short stories. But then around 2000, I guess it was 2010, I started writing a series of children's books. I didn't really think of them as children's books. They kind of got marketed that way, but they're more in children's books in the way that maybe Golden Compass, if you're familiar with the Golden Compass books, that those are children's books. That was kind of what I was shooting for. Anyway, I ended up selling those books as a series, as a 4-book series called The Keepers. That was the bulk of the writing that I did for the next 7 or 8 years of my life. That was my writing career. I still do other kinds of writing, short literary fiction, creative nonfiction, and hope to do more juvenile writing in the future. But anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit today. If you're not familiar with The Keepers, the Keepers series is what we'd call an urban fantasy series. So I'm assuming a lot of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the term, but in case you're not, an urban fantasy is in the Harry Potter kind of mold. So it takes place in the world that we recognize as our own, but there's an aspect or a hidden element or this secret corner of the world that's known to only a select few, and that's how my series functions. The books are long, they're hefty, they're what we would call crossover books. So my audience, as a writer thinking about writing fantasy, urban fantasy, my audience was both kids and adults. I think I remember we had conversations when the books came out about what we were going to put on the book in terms of age group, and because they've got this whole middle grade thing, which is weird, 8 to 12. But we ultimately ended on 10 and up. I was like, it needs to go all the way up, and I think a lot of the audience that I was writing for when I was working on the books was really, I wanted it to be the kind of book that an adult could enjoy, that they could read and find it fulfilling and not sort of full of holes or a little stitched together. And they had some compelling adult characters as well. So that's what I set out to do, and I worked on that for about 7 or 8 years. What I'm going to talk about today is, and we'll have time for questions in the end, but if you have any questions as I go along, you can feel free to throw them up in the chat, and I'll try to answer them. But I thought what I would do is just share a little bit of my work process and working on the books. I think with fantasy in particular, there's I don't want to say it's a misperception, but I suspect it probably is a misperception that these fantasy books or series that involve, whether they're for a juvenile audience or an adult audience, that they're so intricate and involved sometimes for some huge series, like A Song of Ice and Fire or Wheel of Time or something like that, where we have hundreds of named characters. That what goes into those books is just this enormous amount of planning and outlining and sketching out of the world ahead of time. And generally I found that tends not to be the case. It certainly wasn't the case for me. And even in the case of, I'm going to paraphrase here, so don't quote me on this, but George R.R. Martin, The Song of Ice and Fire, right? Game of Thrones. When he talked about starting the series, writing the first book in the series, he basically said, I just, started writing this scene about these men in the north, hunting, and then the dire wolves came in, and he didn't really know anything else, but he said he just kept writing the scene, thinking about who these people were and what they were doing, and that he would just start inventing names of lands or of kings as the narrative was progressing. And he said at some point, he's like, I better start writing some of this stuff down because people are going to ask me about it. People are going to say, well, how does this all work? Now you look at what it became, and it seems like this very intricately plotted world. But the reality is that he, like most writers I know and that I talk to, and certainly like myself, even when we're writing what seems like an intricately plotted fantasy with an intricately imagined sort of backstory or world of magic or whatever it might be, they often don't work that way. They evolve organically from the process of what the writer is trying to do. So what I'm going to do today, I'll start off by sharing some documents that I have that might be of interest, just to see kind of where my process was in working through the series and getting from the point of just, I have an idea and I kind of want to write this book, I think, to the point where I'm working with my agent and my editor and getting the final thing out there that ended up being in print. So I'm gonna share the screen, and I've got several things open here, so apologies. There might be a little bit of randomness to kind of the way that I go through things, but I'll try to keep things in order as best I can. So I'll pull this one up first to share. This is well, I don't know if you guys are seeing what I want you to see. Hang on, sorry, apologies. I've got several screens open here. There it is. Now I'm seeing. Hopefully you're seeing. Salam, maybe you can make sure we're seeing the one that's pink and says there's an Einstein quote at the top.
Yes.
Okay, great. So what this is a document. You can see, if you can see at the top, master notes. And I don't want you to be at all confused about this. This was not something that I put together before I started writing the books. This is something that did not exist before I started writing the books. This is sort of my moment of as I guess on the smaller scale, only 4 books, long books. I do like 500,000 words in total for my series, but not Song of Ice and Fire. But still, this is my version of thinking to myself, oh, I better start writing some of this stuff down. This is in no particular order. You can see some of the quotes up here are things that I thought might make nice epigraphs for the books. But otherwise, this is just a document that I put together, kind of keeping of notes, and you can see these did end up being the 4 titles of the books in the series. But otherwise, it's just kind of a lot of random notes, just I thought of something and I would go in here and throw it down. Entanglement because there's a lot of, the books have a lot of magic in them, but it's a magic that is grounded. I guess let me back up a second. For just a second, because what you're seeing here is kind of my loose thoughts about what happened later. When I first started writing the series, I had worked in a bookstore here in town. If there's anybody in the audience today who's lived here for more than 15, 20 years, you might remember Pages for All Ages bookstore. So I worked for Pages for All Ages back when it was in Champaign at Old Farms. And this was in the era when Harry Potter was coming out. This is like mid to late 90s. And I worked mostly in the children's department. I was a book buyer. So when it came time to write the books, well, I should say, when it came time to the moment in my life when I started writing the books, it was more, I'd been writing literary fiction and I wanted to write fantasy. And my stories were already a little weird, not necessarily fantasy stories at all, but not necessarily realistic either, all of them. But I had always had a love of fantasy, read fantasy, certainly when I was younger and as an adult, and wanted to give it a try. And I had this idea, just to back up and give you a sense of what the series is about. And the idea was that there was a box, an object that you could open. And if you open the box and look through it, you could see one day into the future. So you could open it wherever you were. And I, for the purposes of the book, I designed this whole box thing, and it was about, I have one around here somewhere, but I couldn't find it, unfortunately. My cousin made one. It's pretty cool. But anyway, it's about this big. And when you look through it, you can see one day into the future. The one my cousin made doesn't actually work, but in the book it works. And it's this object called the Feldera, an invented word, the Feldera, which means box of promises. That's how it's translated. Now, that idea itself isn't necessarily new. I think there's even a Goosebumps book, if you guys remember Goosebumps, where there's a camera that'll show you what's going to happen to you tomorrow or something like that. The idea itself isn't new, but I was stuck with the idea for a long time, just this notion of, and I'm a science nerd, so I wanted it to be a scientifically at least semi-plausible kind of thing going on. So I knew I was already messing with things because it's time travel, but I'm like, it can only be future because that seems more plausible than the past from what we know. And I just wanted a story for it. And in fact, I tried writing a couple of literary stories using the device of the box where you could see one day into the future, but it just didn't work. And then eventually, I hit that day where I was like, I do want to write a kid's book. What do I want to write? And I was a fan of Harry Potter, but to be honest, was a little frustrated by Harry Potter because the magic sort of lets you do everything. If you have magic in your world, you're like, well, sure, we'll just do magic to do that. You guys have probably seen the famous, like, how it should have ended with Harry Potter, if you've ever seen that one, where like Dumbledore gets the time turner and like goes back and he's like 10,000 turns should do it, and he goes back and like meets Voldemort as when he's still a child, that preteen Voldemort, and just is like abracadabra, and he's like, I've just saved us all a lot of trouble. So the problem with magic is if it's just magic, you can do anything. And don't get me wrong, I love the Harry Potter books, and if they hadn't existed, I don't think I would have tried to write my books. But the one thing I wanted to do was ground it in science. So I was already thinking about the science of how one could look into the future and what that means. And I thought, well, let's do a kid's book. Let's do a kid's book, and there's this object, and there's a kid who has this object, this box, that lets him look one day into the future. And then that started getting me thinking about, well, maybe there's a bunch of such objects and they all have different powers and they all bond to different kids and they give kids special powers according to their personalities or natural talents. And I came up with a list, and that was all the planning that I did to get back to this notion of how do you plan to write your fantasy novel. That was all the planning I did. I had this idea of the box for years and it never found a home. And then literally in maybe a day, I was like, I realized, oh, there's a kid. This is a kid thing. And he's 12, 13. He has the box. He's going to learn how to use it. And I started making a list of, like I said, the other objects that might be there. I immediately started thinking about who the bad guy is going to be, because you need your conflict, of course. And I'm going to stop sharing just for a second. And you, And you actually get to this point where you're thinking, okay, well, now what? And for me, and I think this is the advice I would give to everybody who's here, is the advice is then you start writing your story. I didn't worry about exactly what the plot was going to be, or what the structure was going to be, or what my ending was going to be, or God forbid, what my themes were going to be. I just started writing scenes. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. The first thing I did was I outlined the chapters, and I've still got a notebook somewhere where I outlined vaguely, literally like 10 words per chapter, like Horace meets the bad guy, that kind of thing. And I think the original outline had maybe 21 chapters for book one of the series, but the finished version of book one, the published version of book one, has over 50 chapters. So I was off in my very brief outline, and that's fine, because that wasn't the process that was going to work for me, and I think it's a process that doesn't necessarily work for a lot of writers. And the reason that we don't necessarily want to plan out our whole world, or our politics, or our magic system, or whatever it is because we want to let characters drive the story. You want to let the characters be the ones stepping in and saying, I am this person in this moment in my life, and I'm going to do this. And one thing I say to my, as Salam mentioned, I teach creative writing. I take that endeavor very seriously. I'm serving as the director of the creative writing program right now. And as I'm saying to at the University of Illinois, and as I say to my students all the time, plot is nothing more than characters making decisions. Aside from natural events, tornadoes and hurricanes and whatnot, plot is characters deciding to do things. And those decisions have to feel authentic to who they are and the situation they're in the moment. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have concepts driving what's going on. For me, I had this core concept of this magical object, and it is going to be bound to a particular character who is going to, almost uniquely among humans, have the ability to actually use this object and to take advantage of its power. So I'm thinking, okay, I've got a box that allows you to look into the future, but I'm thinking immediately, before I've written any scene, before I've written any kind of synopsis, I'm thinking, well, what kind of kid would be able to handle that power? Because if you think about it, you look into the future, well, you can't guarantee that. There's a couple things. One, if you look into the box and you see the future, and then that future is definitely going to come true, you have no free will. Nobody wants that book. So then that means you have to look into the box, and the box can be wrong sometimes. So I'm having to think about what kind of a kid, how does this work, first of all? What kind of a kid is going to have the mindset to be able to handle that pressure of looking into the box and being able to see clearly? So I invented a dynamic where, if the future was uncertain for whoever was looking through it, it would be sort of fuzzy. You wouldn't be sure what you were seeing. And also that if you looked through the box and saw a future, and then you later, for example, I have a scene where Horace looks through the box and he later decides, and he sees himself eating a salami sandwich or something the next day. So then it's the next day and he's like, do I have to eat this sandwich? I saw myself eat the sandwich in the box. That's the future. But what if I don't want to eat the sandwich? That means the box can be wrong. And so he has this scene where he chooses not to eat the sandwich, but then it feels really terrible. Like he feels kind of this sickness overcomes him. And so he learns how to understand that the future is flexible and that it's very dependent upon the mindset that he takes into it when he opens the box in the first place, and what it is he's hoping to see. Frankly, he has to hope to see the truth of whatever the future is going to be. So for me, that's already character development. And I'm thinking, who is this kid? I've already decided I know I want an intact family. He's going to be a smart kid, but a little bit weirdo. I don't want him to be an orphan, because kids in these stories are always orphans for obvious reasons. If you're an orphan, you can get up to all kinds of trouble because you don't have parents reining you in, right? But I didn't want him to be an orphan, and so I wanted his family to be intact, and his parents to be characters in the story. And so he ended up being a kid who's conscientious. He's good at science. He's not so good maybe at some other classes. He's punctual. He has a good sense of time innately. He's one of those people who, you know, is like, oh, the cookie timer is about to go off. And then from there, I just kind of ran with that idea, and the other magical objects that I invented for the story also ended up informing the characters. One of the other main characters is Chloe, who has a pendant that allows her to walk through walls. And so for me as a process, as a writer, I'm thinking, well, what would you do with that power? If you're 12 or 13 and you have that power to be able to walk through walls, which is already very complicated, because if you can walk through a wall, what's to keep you from sinking through the floor, right? So I'm thinking about it in those terms, and I'm thinking, okay, this kid, I want her to be different from Horace, and she's a little more reckless. Maybe her home isn't as intact, and she's doing things with her power that maybe most kids wouldn't do, or you shouldn't do, like sneaking into stores at night. Who's to stop you, right? One of her things is she ends up sneaking, ironically, into the library at night and taking books she likes, because she doesn't want to go through the whole checking out books. So she just sneaks into the library with her power at night and takes out books and brings them home. And she's just got this huge pile of library books at home. So, you know, I'm taking the ideas, the concepts, and you want to let those concepts drive the story. But if you let the concepts alone drive the story, what happens is then you're creating characters that must adhere to your ideals. And that's not what you want. You want a story that adheres to the ideals of your characters. So if you have a concept that's going to be your ultimate goal, and you're not going to dial it back and say, well, who's my character? Who are they today? How do they feel right in this moment? Crucially, what is their attitude about what's happening around them? The story's not going to ring true for a reader, no matter how cool your ideas are or how cool the concepts are. It's only going to work if the characters feel real. But you can allow those characters to be driven by your concepts. You just have to then invest deeply in those characters. So I'll share a couple of other documents too. So just to give you a sense of kind of what the process was. I dug this up. I actually haven't seen this in forever, but this is me. This is like the first draft of the very first chapter of the book, when I was like, okay, I've got this Horace guy, and he's got this good sense of time, and he's responsible mostly, but kind of not, and he's got an intact family. He's an only kid. And they just ended up writing this scene where he's at home with his family. I have this line, which I thought was cutesy. Horace saw it coming, because later he's going to get the power to see the future, you know. But, you know, this, whatever it is, there's only about 1,000 words here. None of this is in the book. This is the first thing I ever wrote for the series. I don't think a single one of these words. There's a reference here to a Mrs. Moss, which was my imagined history teacher. Oh, that's what it was. I originally imagined, well, what would a 12-year-old do with this power? And I'm like, well, maybe he's really bad at one subject. He's great at science, loves that. But history, just not so much. He's just not interested. He wants to do things that are in the now. He's not interested in history. So at one point, I actually had him, in an earlier draft, I actually had him cheating on a history test with the box of promises. Because you think about it, it's Wednesday, it's 2:40, you're sitting in your history class, there's a test tomorrow. You bring in your box and you look down and you can see tomorrow's test on your desk today. So I was like, that's a pretty cool idea. Here's the thing, none of that ended up in the book. In the book, there's no Mrs. Moss. He never cheats on a test. But all of that thinking helped to start to give me a sense of what the story was going to be, and crucially, who Horace was going to be as we're going along. I'll pull this document back up. This is the master notes I was referring to before. So this is me just making a lot of random notes. Later on, it got more organized. But I want to emphasize, none of this existed before I started writing the books. This was all stuff that I added to as I was writing the books. So this was actually, this stuff would actually follow, for the most part, things I had written. Or if there was an idea I wanted to not forget, I would just throw it in here. Later, I organized it. So here's my main character, his full name. You'll notice too, I use this little code here. You can see things are underlined. That means, yes, that's canon. that means I've said yes. And you can see there's some ridiculous sort of stuff here, but there's actual dimensions of the box, which I wanted to be close to the golden ratio, because I'm that kind of nerd. But as you go on through, there's all this stuff about Horace, who's again our main character, other things, that terms that I wanted to get in there. Like, for example, this is an example I wanted to get out early on. A fool's proof. This is a term that comes up in the books. This is a term Mrs. H is Mrs. Hapstead, one of the sort of in the know, old wise characters in the book. It's a term she uses to describe agreeing to do or to not do something based on what the box reveals before ever opening a box. That is, the bad thing is to predicate an action upon what the box shows, rather than reacting to or interpreting what the box shows. So in other words, for example, I was thinking, well, okay, if you say, okay, hey, I'm going to let you go back home and see if your dad's okay, but only if I look in the box right now and see that you make it back safely. And everyone's like, deal, okay, we'll do that. And then you open the box and you look and you see what happens, and then you see the thing you hoped to see instead of the thing that might have actually happened, because your motivations for opening the box were predicated on the decisions rather you were going to make were predicated on opening the box. So this whole document, and you can see it's 44 pages, it's 11,000 words. This is all just stuff that I kind of put together. These are the bad guys, the ribbon. Some of these notes are canon, and others of these notes, when I read them now, they just don't make any sense. They're not what I ended up doing. There's a lot of ideas in here, terms or things like that never made it into the book. Some did, some didn't. Here's one thing that's just something, some device that I hope to invent at some point in the series. And I think I actually did in that particular case, but not always. And when you go through the process, another thing I do, and let's see if I can share this screen with you too. It might be of some interest if I can find it here. So yeah, here it is. So here's, this is just an example. This is what my working folder looked like when I was working on the series. So let me collapse this, but you can see at the top it says Makers. That's because I originally wanted to call the series The Makers, which I later didn't want. What I really wanted to call the series was The Wardens. It ended up being called The Keepers because the publisher liked it better, which ended up being a little unfortunate because I think it's just more generic. Plus there was like a documentary series that came out at the time about nuns that was also called The Keepers. Anyway, it should have been called The Wardens, but my file here is called The Makers. You can see just the sheer quantity of work product that's involved in a process, in a product like this, especially maybe the way I do it. This first folder here is just master stuff, meaning for the whole series. But this folder here, you can see right here, starting with Dragonfly. So this is for the first book in the series, The Box and the Dragonfly. And I'll just scroll down so you can see a lot of this is editorial stuff once I was working with the publisher. But you can scroll down and just see how much is involved. And what you'll also see as I scroll down and show you a little bit about my process, you'll see one thing I do, and these are the old versions of them. When I'm working on a draft of a book like this, I work in chapters. I don't have a document that is the book. I have many documents that are chapters of the book. So you can see down here, the numbering gets a little weird. Old chapter 1, old C, old chapter 2C. You get down here, there's a 12.2 and a 12. The numbers start to repeat, or I get into revamp new 3. So what happens is, what I find that it's much easier to just have a chapter that I'm working on. And I might think it will be chapter 5, but then later I realize, oh, this is more like chapter 8 because I got more stuff to do. But that's fine. The important part for me was having a sense of the nugget of each beat of the story. And so I had a vague sense of a chapter list, which again evolved greatly and more than doubled in size. But as a practical matter, when I wanted to work on the book and when I would sit down in front of the computer to work, what I would do was simply open up the files that I wanted to work on. And look, sometimes I'll open up a chapter. I'm opening up chapter 4 and I want to work on chapter 4. And it's just not happening. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not feeling it. I feel kind of stuck. Well, that's cool, because I'm pretty sure I know a thing that's going to happen later on, or at least I'm going to try it. So let me jump to chapter 9 and I'm going to start writing that. or there was one scene in particular that I knew I wanted because of the relative powers of the box, the box of promises, the Feldera, and the pendant that allows Chloe to walk through walls, which is the dragonfly in the first book title, the box and the dragonfly. There was a particular set piece that I wanted with those two pieces, which ended up being kind of the climactic scene of the book. It was one of the first scenes I wrote. The version that I originally wrote is nothing like what ended up in the book, but what that process does, not having a single document where I'm just working on my book, means that I don't have much danger of stalling. Because if I stall on a particular scene or a chapter, that's cool. I'll just jump somewhere else. I'm just going to jump ahead 20 pages, 100 pages, 200 pages. Heck, maybe I'll write a scene that might appear in book number 2, just to keep the juices going, to keep my confidence going about the world that I'm creating and the characters that I'm working with. So for me, having all these files here as separate chapters was necessary process for me. And then eventually you have to stitch those together and figure out how things are working. You can see 53 chapters is, I think, what it ended up with in the final version of the book. But it took a long time to get there, and it really took that process of feeling like I was free to go wherever I wanted. I will say that doing things that way, having a separate file for each chapter, I recommend it if you're working on a novel. Especially a fantasy novel, which tends to be longer and have more sort of infrastructural support behind it. I recommend doing the independent chapters because it can be easy to be stuck on a moment of, for example, world building, or deciding on the history of your world, or the rationale for something that's part of the magic or the fantastic element that you're inventing. And if you get hung up on that little thing, then you can derail other things that might not yet be derailed, like your sense for who a character is or the action flow of the scene. So being able to jump ahead or jump back or jump wherever you want in the novel, strongly recommend that. Just be aware that it means a little more work on the back end in terms of stitching things together or rewriting. I'm a big rewriter anyway. In fact, the first draft of this novel, the first novel in the series, was 215,000 words, and I cut it, which was too long. 215,000 words is just a monstrous book. Now we are talking like adult fantasy. So I cut it down to 135, I think was the final version, which is 80,000 words. And just to give you a frame of reference, that's how much I cut out of the novel. Just to give you a frame of reference, the first Harry Potter book was 90,000 words. So I cut about a Harry Potter 1's worth of text out of the book as I was working on it. Speaking of cuts, actually, I'll share this screen too. This is another sort of writing technique that I'll share. I don't know if it's going to be helpful for people, but I think it's certainly something I like to do. Oh, I don't actually see it here. Actually, maybe I don't have that open right now. But one thing I do is when I'm working, I'll actually create a separate document just for cuts. The great question in the chat, I'll get to that in a second. When I'm dealing with cuts, I actually created a separate document called cuts. And then when I would cut something, not a little thing, but like if I was going to cut a scene or even a line that I thought was cool, or sometimes in some cases whole chapters or whole storylines. An original draft of the book had this best friend named Dave, and he and Horace had this hobby where they would build toothpick models and blow them up with firecrackers. And none of that's in the final book. So, but when I wanted to cut stuff, I had a separate document where I would cut it out of my main document and just drop it in cuts. And then I would put a heading on it just so I could remember, this is when so-and-so did that. And now here's the thing. I almost never dipped back into that cut file and put stuff back in the story, back in the novel. I did a couple of times, but not much. But the fact that I had that cut file there, that I had taken stuff out and kind of put it in a digital trash can that hadn't been emptied, was hugely freeing, because it allowed me to just make big swings at cuts, knowing that if I just later decided, that was a big mistake, I could just yoink it back from my cuts file. Yeah, good question from Owen in the side there. Did you ever end up with continuity issues with this method? Yeah, I did. Funny you should ask. I'll share a screen here. Let's see if I can find this one now. My files all seem to be a little wonky, but I did, and I would have to keep track of that. So here's the document here. So in this, sorry, it's showing up for you, but not for me yet. Hang on, there it is. Okay, so continuity things. So this was a document that was continuity things to check. And you can see it's 6 pages long. This was just for, well, it wasn't just for book 1 because it would have bled over into the other books as well. But what I would do is just, rather than be derailed by the writing, or derailed from my writing by being distracted by some continuity problem I'd run into, either via creation or via rereading what I'd already written, I would just make a note. So this is my document. For example, C is Chloe. Be sure Chloe's backstory allows for something she needed to fear as a child. M-mom. That's, by the way, I haven't looked at this in forever, so it's hilarious for me to read this. If you've read the series, or if you do read the series, the whole backstory with Chloe's mom ends up being like a huge major thing in the series, and Chloe's mom figures through right to the very end. And here I am, I guess this is my proto version of thinking, yeah, maybe something there. Turns out to be a huge thing. Yeah, little notes. Yeah, some of these things are kind of ancient. This is really fascinating. Yeah, here's one. The underline again is my code here for meaning, yes, this is canon. That's in the book. There's a part where Horace hides in a boiler, like in the ash door of a defunct boiler in an old theater building in the book. And then it's like, okay, no, Chloe closes the door. I got to make sure about that. Or here's another one. After I made these cuts I was just mentioning about Mrs. Moss and history class and Dave, I had to make sure that I had cut all references from the manuscript as a continuity issue, because there might be a casual reference to Dave in a chapter that had nothing to do with Dave, but Dave no longer exists. So yeah, you can see a lot of things here. Little notes, sometimes just little things about the way I'm formatting words, capitalizing things. Yeah, one of the other really big problems I had with continuity in my particular case was that Horace had this box that he could look into the past with, which meant that things mattered down to the second. So I also have like spreadsheets where I'm like charting the time by the second, and Horace keeps track of time to that degree because that's his thing. That's why his name's Horace, like the root of Horace, hours, right? Time. So there's scenes where I actually have spreadsheets where I'm charting things out. The actual ancient artifact, I was hoping I could find it, but the actual ancient artifact, when I was first plotting out the continuity of days, because it would be like, okay, I've got a scene where Horace looks through the box and he sees tomorrow, but then I've got to write the scene that happens tomorrow. So I've got to make sure that those scenes match up and that the things, or that they don't if things go awry. But generally, I'm trying to make sure things match up. My original artifact, before I realized I could just do this with a spreadsheet, because I'm just kind of a Luddite nerd in some ways, I had a giant cardboard tube and I had a long strip of paper. And what I did was I wrapped the paper around it in spirals. And then I would write plot points on it, rotating around the tube. And each rotation of the tube was 24 hours. So it would be like 12:33 and 49 seconds on Wednesday. And then the next strip over on the rotation was that exact time on Thursday. And then I'd have to be, careful that this is what's going on when Horace opens the box and sees tomorrow. So, yeah, continuity is a thing. So much so, not just, and I would say too that for a professional writer, it's not just a matter of the kind of continuity we'd think of in terms of, do things make sense? But I've actually had this other document I'll show you real quick. This is a separate continuity document that I had that's a tonal continuity thing, tonal smoothing. So this is me thinking about some of these issues where I feel like the first moment I wrote this scene, I kind of had one vibe going on, but then later as I refined the scene, a different vibe was going on in my mind, and therefore the tone of it just isn't matching up, you know. Like, for example, one of the things that was this last one here, Mrs. Hapstead, who's one of the in the know sort of wise old people, I really had trouble dialing her in at first and figuring out how old she was. I realized that I wanted that in early chapters, she was very strict and sort of old fashioned and school marmish. And her speech was very grandiloquent. And I didn't like that because in later chapters, she had evolved and had become a little more of a wisecracker and a little younger and a little bit more of a firebrand and stoic, but in a kind of wink in the eye kind of way. And so I had to go back tonally and change her character in earlier chapters because I had learned about her as the story went on, and the things that you learn are important to what you're going to do. I think one of the important things when we're thinking about any kind of writing is that when you commit something to the page, it becomes a potential part of what you then understand about the world. You invent something, and if it's the right thing, then you invest in it and you double down on it and you build resonance around that thing. But sometimes you don't get it right until a long way in, especially if you're working on a novel. And that means you have to go back and retrofit the earlier stuff to meet your new, better versions of the characters and places and ideas that you're trying to create. But hopefully you can open it up to some more questions if people have any. Otherwise I can keep talking. But one thing I did want to address, particularly as an advice about world building, one is, again, the quicker you can get into your characters, this is, I think, a good way of putting it. If you're going to build your whole fantasy world and your magic system and your politics and whatever it might be, if you're going to build that ahead of time and then put a story into it, what you're doing is you're saying to your characters, go and be this thing I want you to be. Conform to the world that I've created for you and the plot ideas I've created for you. That's not the way most great novels are written. That's not the way most good novels are written. What happens is you have a vague idea of what you want to happen, and then you put characters down and you let them do what they want to do. And that goes very much in hand with thinking about how you're going to build the world, because those characters need to feel like they belong in the world that you are creating and that it is just simply the world to them. What that means is, and this is kind of the fun part, is that, like George R.R. Martin did, you can just start writing a story and just start making up names and just start having your characters use those names in the same way that we use names, in the same way that we would readily say, oh, down on campus or over in West Champaign, or, up at, oh, damn, Dell's company went out of business, like those names, we just use them and assume people will understand them because those people live in our world. And our characters in our not fantasy works should therefore do the same. And you need to trust the reader to trust you. You need to trust the reader to trust you to eventually fill in the blanks and answer some of the questions that are being raised by the little hints you're dropping early on. So, there's no reason not to jump right into names, to have characters operating in their world as though it's just their world. You want to avoid the trap of the giant exposition dump that has derailed many a fantasy novel, where the writer just wants to get out their cool ideas about the world they've invented. But here's the problem. Here's the dirty secret about all that. It's really easy to invent a cool world. It's much harder to set actions into motion in that world with compelling characters that readers care about. So the more you can start focusing on, the more quickly you can start focusing on characters and allow them to shape or alter the world you thought you were creating, the more authentic not only that world is going to feel, but the more authentic that narrative is going to feel. So names, crucial. Jump right in, use them, the lingo, have the people living in that world, and trust your reader to trust you to slowly fill in the blanks for the things that they're not yet maybe fully understanding. It's about, well, it is 7:45. So I'd like to open up to questions if people have them. I can talk about, craft stuff or, process stuff, publishing stuff, whatever people might be interested in hearing.
So while we're waiting for questions, I'll start us off, and you might have kind of already touched on this, but when you first started writing The Box and the Dragonfly, did you know it was going to be a series, or did that kind of happen organically?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I did right away. I had, and by the way, I don't recommend it. I had a lot of fun writing the first book, but and this is always the thing, like, nobody wants you here to complain about it because, like, oh, you got a 4-book deal, but I got a 4-book deal, and that meant I was writing the last 3 books under contract, one a year, and these are like 500-page books, so it wasn't easy. But yeah, I think, let's see, how would I put that? Yeah, I think if you're going to ask me that question again, because I think I'm getting a little off track. I have a lot of thoughts about it. Can you ask me that question again, Salim?
Yeah. So for the first book, The Box and the Dragonfly,
Yeah.
did you know that it was going to be a series, or did it kind of happen over time or happen organically?
Yeah, good question. So it definitely happened. Well, I would say kind of a mix, actually, to be perfectly honest. You never know how the process is going to go, and you're never going to know how the actual reception of the thing is going to go, I guess. So when I was first writing, I was like, I just want to tell a cool story. I wasn't thinking about publishers. I wasn't thinking about how long it was going to be. But if I'm being perfectly honest, once I started making the list of the magical objects that were in there, I was like, yeah, man, this is like 7 books. like pretty instantly, I was like, yeah. I was thinking Harry Potter scale, I guess. And I was thinking that there's a lot of books here. The problem is, nobody's going to buy 7 books. And I'm super glad it wasn't 7 books, but yes, I knew that it would be more than 1 book, but I did have to do that thing where, and if any of you have read The Wheel of Time, that one of the Wheel of Time, awesome fantasy series, bogs down, but Brandon Sanderson saved it. So, but if you've read that, that like the first book is really awkward because it ends both as though this is the end of the whole thing, or like maybe there might be another book, which was the reality of the situation for Robert Jordan at the time. So for me, yes, I knew it was a series. When I found my agent, I was like, I think this is several books. I don't know. And she said, well, we will pitch this as a 4-book series. And because the usual thing would be a trilogy. She's like, we'll pitch it as a 4-book series. And that's what the publisher, Harper, ended up taking. They took the 4-book series. In retrospect, I think if I were going to do it again, I would write the entire series before trying to sell it, because writing under contract is not fun. I feel bad for George R.R. Martin right now. It's a lot of pressure, and there's that time crunch, and people are watching, and you're still working on the detritus and the revisions of earlier drafts, so earlier books rather. So it's complicated, but yeah, I did know from the beginning that there was a series. Apologies for the confusion there. I was going back. It's been a long time, and I'm going back to thinking about those years, those days. They were heady. In the chat, Bob asks if you have any experience with self-publication. Would you recommend that or traditional publishing? And my standard reaction to that, Bob, would be, yeah, do traditional publishing. But things change, and I think there's probably more respect for that. I have a cousin who is also a writer and self-published a series, a kind of paranormal teen romance series called Ghost Hand. She's self-published. I would say this, that self-publishing, if you're going to do it in a way that's going to be meaningful at all, involves just tremendous amounts of work. I mean, you can see the work I was doing, but I was able to devote all that energy, not all, but most of that energy to the writing. You still have to deal with endless emails from your editor and your agent. And, I went on tour a couple times and stuff which was fun. But you know, there's a lot involved. But when I looked at the stuff that my cousin was doing on her own, self-publishing, it was way more because she was doing everything and she wasn't able to devote as much energy or time to the writing. Now she had a huge online sort of base of fans, listeners already, because she had an online sort of persona going, and that helped a lot. But I think if you have the opportunity to pursue traditional publishing, it's still the way to go. But it partly depends on what you want. If you just want to see an object that is your book, or if you want to be able to have people buy a digital version of your book, self-publishing is a viable way to do that. The reality is that unless you have a baked-in audience for you already, especially if you're doing digital distribution, or even if you want to do print versions, it's hard to make much of an impact with that. I mean, you know, I was lucky. I had a book deal with HarperCollins, and you know, I had like, you know, cardboard displays in the Barnes and Noble in town, which was crazy, you know. And I didn't have to do anything to make that happen, you know. Whereas my cousin is, you know, doing all kinds of self-promotion stuff, which I guess kind of leads into the other question here from Erica. What did you do to publicize the books when they came out? Yeah, thank you, Bob. Because it was with HarperCollins, you know, big publisher, and then I think they, to be frank, I think they thought the books would do better than they did. They were hefty books, but they pushed them pretty big. I think there were some marketing mistakes made, to be honest, and probably some writing mistakes as well. But I didn't have to do much. Well, that's not true. It felt like I had to do a lot. But that's because I hate that. I don't like publicizing my books. I'm not a salesman. I'm a writer, and I just want to write stuff that hopefully some people think is good enough to tell other people to try it out too. So I mean, I didn't have a Twitter account. My agent made, I do now, but I barely tweet on it. My agent made me get a Twitter account. I did some radio shows and things like that. I did lots of tour stuff, which was great. So I would tour to schools. You don't go and do readings, you just go to schools and do talks. And because I had the science element in the books, I could do these kind of science talks at schools, which was great. The most ridiculous thing to publicize the books when they came out, and again, the marketing team does all this stuff. I don't. Well, that's not true. Sometimes people would reach out to me individually, and I'd set up a school event. That still happens. I've got one next week, in fact. But for the most part, the publishers do it. You know, the marketing team does it. The sales team, your book rep does that kind of stuff. The most ridiculous thing I did was I had to do this online. There was this thing called, what was it called, Coos Country or something? I don't know. It was some tween hangout where you'd go online and people had digital avatars of themselves, and they would like hang out in digital rooms, and it was all like 8-bit looking, and people would come and chat with each other. And so they made an avatar of me, and I like showed up in the digital room like, hello, fellow students, like doing this all talking about my book thing and answering chat questions. It was weird, but most of that stuff, 90% of it was directed by the publisher. If you want to do stuff on your own, then you know, it kind of depends on your market. For me, because I was writing juvenile, I had a baked-in market of schools who wanted to have people come and visit and give a talk, and so I could do that. If you're writing for adults, you know, the market, there's not as big of a market for that. You know, there aren't people looking to fill the school day with potentially interesting guests. So the self-publication, you know, so much of it happens online. And if you are savvy at creating your online persona and talking about your writing and talking about your project, whether it's self-published or traditionally published, that's a huge leg up. And it's an area in which I myself am really terrible. And in fact, I have a Facebook page that I don't even know how to log into because my wife runs it. I have like an author page on Facebook. That's how off the grid I am on that kind of stuff. If I was left to the point where I had to self-publish, it would be tough, because I think I lack the skills to promote. But my solution to that would be to work harder to get my work to where I can hopefully get the attention of an agent or somebody who's going to pay attention, and just work hard on that front. But that would be me. I think self-publishing works for a lot of people. Yeah, I see your question there, Christina. A question about developing conflict. I have a hard time towing the line between not having enough of a conflict and creating an obvious conflict. I'd love some suggestions. Yeah, I feel that. For me, you know, when I'm writing literary fiction, the conflict always kind of finds itself. If I'm writing a short story, you know, the conflict reveals itself, even if I don't know what it's going to be in the beginning. If you're writing fantasy, if you're writing speculative fiction in general, where plot is more of a premium, you know, you got to have plot, and that means you have to have conflict. Then you do really find yourself in a position where you have to figure out who the bad guys are. For me, I had to do that really early on. So I was like, okay, who are the bad guys? What do they want? And I'm like, okay, well, they're bad guys. They want these magical objects that all these kids are bonding to. And it turns out these bad guys think they're the rightful owners, right? And they were creepy looking. They had a way of disguising themselves so they would look normal to normal people. But if you were one of these kids who could be Tanji, was the term in the book. So if you were Tanji, your object is also called Tanji because the bond is of that nature where the terms are the same. But if you're Tanji, you can see these disguised bad guys, the Riven, they're called. You can see them for what they really are. And they were tall and kind of bug-like and creepy. And they were always hunting around and kind of sniffing around to find these missing Tanji because they claimed them as their own. Now, for me, I felt like ultimately it felt like it was too obvious a conflict, like you were talking about. Like, okay, well, there's clear good guy and clear bad guy here. And so we know what's going to happen. The good guys are going to win. But I realized pretty early on that it was too simple. And so I ended up kind of toying with the notion and really fully developing the notion of the fact that, well, are the bad guys bad? And are the good guys good? Because the reality is, of course not. You know, with few exceptions, most of the, I mean, we can think of it, so even today, especially maybe, we can think of bad guys, but, you know, the reality is you just need to think about what the conflict is going to be, how that conflict is going to manifest itself on the page. Are there going to be battles? Is it going to be political strife? Is it going to be, you know, a sort of interfamily, personal kind of wars? What's it going to be? And then I think it's just a matter, if you can cloud the issue of not thinking too black and white in terms of good guys and bad guys, that automatically creates depth in the conflict right there. And it's important to remember and to help you in keeping in mind that there's no such thing as a good guy and a bad guy, that there's no such thing as what happened. There's just an experience. We all know that 10 people can watch the same event and come away with 10 different experiences of what happened. So who's to say what really happened? Even a camera on the scene would be limited in what it could tell you, right? So I think thinking of things in those ambiguous ways can help make your conflicts more complicated. Yeah, what are literary agents generally looking for when you're presenting an initial pitch? Here's the thing to know about literary agents. They're extremely busy. They're extremely useful. If you can land an agent, they're worth every bit of what they do. But it's hard to do. And that's because they're deluged with requests and queries. And what I found, secret little, it's not that secret. I think there was actually an article about it in Poets and Writers or something, but I got my agent after I had the opportunity to meet her in person, after she had, and I didn't even know this at the time, but when I went back to my database of agents later on, I'd actually submitted my novel to her in like 2011 and had just gotten, I think, zero response. And then I had the opportunity to meet her in person at Breadloaf. I was at the Breadloaf Writers Retreat, which was a great opportunity to meet agents, and met her in person, and she ended up signing me on. But I think and so here's the thing, there's just no accounting for whether an agent's going to get back to you or not. They're getting so many things. Oftentimes it's not even the agents who are reading your query letter or your idea, it's their assistant. And the assistant has maybe just been instructed, well, we've been getting a lot of fantasy novels lately, let's set those aside. because when you get so many submissions like we do with Ninth Letter, our literary magazine on campus, you're just looking for reasons not to take something, but you are looking for reasons not to take something. You're looking for reasons to say, nope, next. And that's harsh. It's really harsh, but that's the reality of it. So what they're looking for, it will vary from agent to agent. You do want something that is sellable. It is really helpful to be able to say in your query letter that to compare it to some other successful book, or perhaps a few books. They're like, your so-and-so meets so-and-so. They like that kind of stuff. They are thinking very much in terms of, agents are not sitting there thinking, what is the very best piece of writing that crossed my desk today? They're thinking, what is the most marketable piece of material that's crossed my desk today? So if you're sending them something that is, they feel like there's too many of these books kind of glutting the market right now, or they just took on a client who's got a very similar project, they'll just say no, even if the writing is great. So, you know, to try to answer that question more usefully, what's a literary agent generally looking for? There's no telling. And so the solution is just, and I hate to say this because it makes me feel skeezy, but if you really want to submit work, if you really want to get an agent, just keep bombing them with your submissions. keep sending them in. Keep querying, and keep hoping you get somebody who responds. I mean, look, I sent my work out. When I sent my work out to agents, I had already had one book published. I'd won an NEA grant. I'd had a couple of other awards that make sense to people who are in literary circles. I had some good publications, and I'd say half of the agents that I reached out to about my novel project didn't even answer, didn't even get back to me. So it's hard. And I probably reached out to 70 or 80 agents in total. That's an exaggeration, but probably 50. And I did get some of those who wanted to see more of the book. I even had one agent who offered to take me on, but I maybe arrogantly, she was just getting started and didn't have any other clients. And I was like, I'm going to hang on and get somebody who's a little more connected, which luckily did work out for me. But it's hard to know. But the real secret is just remembering that a rejection does not mean that your work is bad. It means that whoever you sent it to and whoever happened to read it on that particular day at that particular time in whatever stack of other stuff they were reading just didn't feel it. And it's not necessarily a reflection on you. Which kind of goes to the question about, how do you know your writing is good enough, Susan? How do you know your writing is good enough? You don't. Even if you get published, you don't. Because we all know there's crap that gets published and there's excellent stuff that doesn't. I happen to think that more crap gets published than there is excellent stuff that doesn't, because I think excellent stuff finds a way to find a reader, especially if anybody has any kind of perseverance at all. So the reality is, you know, I'll go back to that famous quote that I can never forget, and I never remember who said it, and I always butcher it, but the basic premise is pretty simple. No story is ever finished, it's only abandoned. And so when I stop working on a piece, it's not because I know it's perfect, because I've never written anything perfect, and neither has anyone else. It's just that I've worked it until I'm done. And my urges are taking me on to the next project, and I don't want to work on this anymore. Now my tolerance, and as I think for most professional writers, my tolerance for continuing to work with something until my writing is good enough is very high. But it takes a lot of work. And remember that revision is most of what writing is. You know, I'd say 95% of my time when I'm writing is revision. And a lot of the stuff that I write to begin with is not great, but I try to make it better. Just word by word, sentence by sentence, as best I can.
A lot of great questions tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, is there a national forum for literary agents? That's a good question. There are some online sources, and I wish I could point you to some specifically. There might be other people in here who could, but the best thing is what you can do is you can just try Googling around and trying to find agents. Most of them are based in New York. unfortunately. But just try Googling around. And one thing you can do is just try to, if there's a writer you like, see if you can figure out who their agent is. It's all a little weird, like it's all feels a little bit secret squirrely, but you can get in there and you can figure out who the agents are. And then just, you know, start contacting people who represent the kind of work that you're trying to do and see how it goes. And stick with it. Stick with it.
Thank you, Ted. And while we wait for more questions to come through, if there are any more questions, before we end, since we are kind of nearing the end of our workshop, I do want to give one reminder for the workshop next week, which will be identifying your genre on Wednesday, March 2nd at 7 p.m. with local mystery author Molly McCrae. So be sure to sign up to get the Zoom link if you haven't already. All right, a lot of people in the chat saying thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And apologies again for last time. It's a shame I'll never live down.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Ted. This was great. A lot of useful and wonderful information. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. Thanks everybody for being here.
All right, everyone, we'll see you at the next workshop. Have a good night.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for being here.